Welcome to a new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have two very special guests. We have Constantine Sandis and Gary Browning. Constantine is professor of philosophy at the University of Hertfordshire, founding director of Lex Academic, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in the UK. Gary is a professor of political thought at Oxford Brookes University. He's the author of many books, including Why Iris Murdoch Matters, and A History of Modern Political Thought, The Question of Interpretation, and is co-editor of The Political Art of Bob Dylan. Constantine and Gary are co-editors of the new book, Dylan at 80. It used to go like that, and now it goes like this. Welcome both.
Hey guys, so thank you so much for coming on. And, before we get into just the book itself, right? I mean, I think our audience is going to want to know, how did you guys become so passionate about Bob? Where's that from?
Well,
I think. Well, okay, Constantine, let's start with you. Since you have been paying things.
I was gonna say, I think Gary probably got passionate about Bob a little earlier than me, so that I was just paving the ground for you there.
Oh, right. Well, I think I go back to about 1963, the kind of and the Freewheeling album. I think my brother's girlfriend brought it over. He was older than me. I was about 9, 10, and I thought, hey, this album's really good. I mean, this guy is both serious and it really is kind of, there's an authentic feel to it. It kind of works with traditions and it's really serious. I thought Freewheeling was a fantastic album, and I think I was looking for something at a young age to think, hey, I can hang my coat on this, it's not my parents, this is me, and yeah, it was fantastic. And I think Freewheeling is a great album still.
And since then, my case, oh, sorry.
No, go on.
Since then, you've come to hate him. No.
Not at all.
My parents, my father was a Leonard Cohen fan, but there wasn't any Dylan in the house, and I was really into grunge and punk rock, to be quite honest, and dismissed Dylan as some kind of folky or hippie. Never trust the hippie. And I had this friend who was like, no, Dylan's a punk, and he brought me like Highway 61 Revisited with Dylan sitting there with his Triumph t-shirt, looking kind of like he wasn't going to take anything from anyone and no one was going to tell him what to say or think or do. And I that was the first album. I mean, I'd heard things before, but that was the first album I sort of played from start to finish, and that would have been in the kind of mid-90s. And then soon after that, I mean, I started listening to so much of it over the next 5 years, or catching up with, 25 years worth of music already. And then soon after that, he released, I think, World Gone Wrong was the first Dylan album that came out kind of when I was already a Dylan fan.
Yeah. And so, Gary, what was it about Freewheeling that spoke to you?
Well, I think it was the authenticity. There was a directness to it. And I think actually Girl from the North Country, I thought was good. I mean, I'd heard lots, I was young, but I'd heard quite a lot of romantic ballads, which I thought didn't really tell the truth. Whereas that just seemed very simple, very direct, and it really worked. So, and of course, the other songs were similarly. There was something really direct and kind of clear cut about it. And the lyrics were sharp, and it was really good. It was. Interestingly, on Freewheeling, many years later, my son was into Dylan, and there's a dedication in the book to my son. And he kind of he went straight for early Dylan, like the Freewheeling. He thought was great because he was a musician himself. He thought there was something really direct there, and so it made me feel that. Yeah, I mean, and what Constantine said about Highway 61, I remember hearing that in the King's Road, actually, when it came out. And I thought, hey, that is really kind of something, putting it to you. But and those mid-60s albums, I guess, for a lot of people of my generation and others, it defines Dylan as really cool. But I think my son's liking of freewheeling reminded me that there's a hell of a lot in that early stuff. So that's it, really.
How do you think that Dylan reconciled how he saw himself and how his fans saw him, in the sense that he was heralded as sort of this, as far as his music goes, it spoke politically, philosophically to many listeners. Do you think that he shared the same thoughts that his fans did of himself, or maybe he had a different sort of perspective on his own music?
He definitely wanted to distance himself from that voice of a generation sort of tagline, and would sort of say various things about, you know, what generation and what, you know, I don't speak for these people and so on. Obviously that he upset the folk movement when he went electric, kind of infamously, and he's, I think, in quite interestingly, in while that we have this view of Dylan as kind of, and he released albums like Self-Portrait arguably to kind of distance himself from his fans, or kind of confuse fans and just tell people, you know, he had a lot of people thinking this guy, I mean, it feels crazy now to think about this, but there were people who thought this guy was like some prophet or messiah or something, who were like following him down Greenwich Village, and he really wanted to kind of hide and distance himself from all that. But I think in the last sort of 20-30 years, there's a real bond with his fans at concerts, and way more than I think in earlier years. And there is something there. There's a kind of, and the way they respond to him, and he doesn't talk much on stage, but there's definitely something interactive and a real appreciation. This is someone who loves being on the road, who he's on the road now. He's playing tonight. He restarted yesterday, having played some gigs in November and early December. He's like in, I think, Arizona today. He was in New Mexico yesterday. He's off to Texas tomorrow. This is an 80-year-old man who won't stop. So I think now there is a kind of love between him and his fans. Yeah. Gary, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. What I would say is that early Dylan, and this is when people think of him as the great political kind of folk hero who is the voice of a generation, you know, articulating political truths and so on. I mean, those songs, those early songs actually ask more questions than deliver answers. I mean, famously, Blown in the Wind is a series of questions. But also, I think there are some essays in our book about those early political songs. I did one, and Ray Monk does another. The philosopher Ray Monk does another very good essay, I think. And, you know, and Dylan turns like, I mean, he doesn't give a standard answer in Only a Pawn in Their Game. You know, the assassin of Medgar Evers, you know, Dylan's actually is empathetic to, or sees the poor white, or the white who kills, as it were a part of society, and it's a kind of social problem rather than a easily answered problem. And in The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, Ray Monk urges that we should see that Dylan is turning the question of, like, when are you going to kind of show kind of some kind of feeling for the injustice here, and he's challenging the liberal audience, you know, the liberal audience. And so even at the height of his kind of political phase, if you like, Dylan asks questions like, a hard rain's going to fall. It's still rather difficult to say what the hard rain is. And so Dylan's politics was never a mass off-the-shelf kind of set of answers or nostrums. I mean, the guy was reflective and thinking. And so there's a kind of perspective there which is tricky for an artist, I think, who's not coming out with homilies or nostrums or cliches, but is actually, I mean, massively and magnificently in a small kind of, in a short set of verses, asking profound questions. And that, I think, sets Dylan apart from any kind of mass audience right away. Although the tunes and the songs are so good everyone is there with them, you know. So I think that's interesting. Right from the beginning, Dylan is his own man, you know, and then he goes through, and he's been political ever since, really. I mean, there are political dimensions to, say, Empire Burlesque, a number of political songs on that. And I, in my essay in this book, I talk about Dylan and the political then and now, you know, like Murder Most Foul returns to the scene of the crime, literally, of the 60s, in a sense. And he is ruminative in reflecting upon what does that mean, that tragedy, that political tragedy, what does it mean, you know, for the Kennedys, for the assassins, but also for a culture, I think. How can we live with it? And so Dylan is asking profound questions, and never gonna be an easy mass person, I think. No easy answers. So he's always going to be someone who's maybe set apart. I think that's true. I mean, I would say with Constantine, what Constantine said is fine. And then that kind of link with the audience, I think is kind of more kind of palpable in the last 10 years. However, I remember being with Constantine and another of our contributors, Roger Dalrymple, at Dylan in Hyde Park a few years ago. And Dylan was pretty challenging that day. You know, it was not an easy set. You know, he didn't perform any kind of stylized or classic Dylan style, you know, like a Rolling Stone sounded rather different from how one remembered it. So,
yeah, that's a nice example of, you know, one thing if you imagine if you think of like a Bruce Springsteen concert where everyone is like that, singing along the kind of anthem songs, and then when Dylan plays like some of his biggest hits, like a Rolling Stone, there are some members of the audience who really want to sing along in this way to it, and they can't because he's changed the tune and often the words as well, and it's impossible to sing along to, and it's very hard to think this isn't intentional, that he doesn't want that. He doesn't want sort of a field of people in Hyde Park singing like a Rolling Stone as if there's no problem and we're all united here. And there is something there that he really doesn't like. And so there's a kind of tension between not wanting that kind of easy stadium. I mean, easy, it's not like it's easy to be Bruce Springsteen, but that kind of easy feeling of everyone is together in a kind of communal environment. He doesn't seem to like that, but he does seem to like kind of adding little things for his fans here and there, little things that people will, he knows a lot of the hardcore fans look out for the lyric changes and so on, for example.
Yeah, and his individual idiosyncratic reframing of some of his songs isn't because, I mean, he certainly doesn't like what you just said, Constantine, that kind of very kind of mass sing-along kind of adoption of the singer as the hero. He wants to kind of move on from that, but he's still giving a very engaged performance. Like that version of Rolling Stone we heard was interesting. You know, I mean, I've heard it many, many times, but I found it interesting, even though it was desperately difficult to go with it, you know. So, and Dylan is that highly individual, highly kind of ruminative, reflective person, so that even his kind of early folk anthems are not simple, are not straightforward, you know. They turn back, you know. As he said in 64, I'm liberal to a degree, I want everyone to be free, but if you think I'm going to allow Barry Goldwater to move in next door, you must be mad, kind of thing. So, yeah.
I love that so much. And if you think about it sort of philosophically, right, a lot of the reasons why I think people give up on philosophy is because, you know, it sort of tends to be a little bit dry and a bit, let's say, straightforward, right? So if you think about putting something like that into song where there's a kind of a melody and a rhythm behind it, I can imagine that, you know, sometimes a person might listen to the song and they might think, oh, well, this is really catchy. And then little by little, you know, they start reflecting on the lyrics. And at first they might think, well, you know, these lyrics are kind of difficult, but I still like the tune, right? So I'm still going to kind of hum along to it and sing along to it. But after some time, you know, they're like, no, I really want to understand this. I want to know what this is about. What is he actually trying to tell me? So it's like,
that's that's his greatness, I think.
Yeah, so
precisely
it's like,
that.
It reminds me of kind of Bertolt Brecht has this kind of, you know, the songs. I mean, the lyrics he wrote to songs and even his poems, where you know, there's some stuff that people could easily identify with that seem kind of finger pointing, but then it kind of gets quite dark. There's a lot of stuff about accepting our responsibility as humanity, and it's not just this kind of finger pointing stuff, but it starts looking at you know, society as a whole with him as part of it, not just society's to blame and I'm somehow standing outside of it. And you get that in Dylan, in like Who Killed Davy Moore and songs like that.
Yes, his finger pointing song, maybe he did do finger pointing songs, but the finger pointed at himself and at the audience as much as anyone else. And that's demanding and thoughtful. And as you were saying, you know, gradually, little by little, maybe the audience or the fans come along with him and see the complexity or the reflectiveness of what's happening.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is there have been many times in Dylan's career where he's wanted to sort of get out of the game, to stop touring, stop this whole music thing. Why do you think he's still engaged today? You know, Dylan at 80, why is he still doing it? What's sort of maybe his intention, if you could sort of gauge that?
Well, I mean, I'll just say, I'll try and be brief, you know, I mean, he stopped at various times, partly because he was on a kind of treadmill, I think, you know, in 66, I think if he didn't stop, it would have ended, you know, I mean, in the sense that he was under immense pressure and he wanted to regain a bit of control and a bit of kind of quiet, a bit of ease, you know, so that he could refuel the batteries, I think. So sometimes he stops for that reason. But I think what is absolutely clear about Dylan is that he's massively knowledgeable and relishes song, you know, lyrics, songs, tunes, traditional songs, and music of all kinds, you know, which has quality, you know, from gospel to blues to folk to country to rock and roll, you know. And so this is a guy in love with music, I think, and highly knowledgeable about it, but not in a dry and dusty way, in a lived experience kind of way. So I think he's always going to go back on the road because he is really committed to his trade, to singing, to songs and that, you know, but at times he steps out because the pressures on someone that big, I think, and in that industry are such that you've got to step back. I'll let Constantine.
I mean, there's an interesting question of what it means to stop. I remember reading an interview with Patti Smith, and she's like talking about reading this article on her where, you know, the journalist is saying, oh, and she did nothing for 10 years in the 80s or something. And like Patti Smith is like, what do you mean I did nothing? I was doing a lot of things. I just didn't release a record. And you know, when in these periods where Dylan stops, I mean, especially now with like the bootleg series and so on, he's doing a hell of a lot in some of these periods. And there's bits, you know, there's parts where he might not make a record for a bit, and then there's parts where he stopped touring. And of course, in the 60s, touring was nothing like it is now, with, you know, big money, big stadiums everywhere, and you can tour the whole world. He didn't even make it to the UK on a proper tour till 65, 1965. So I think, yeah, there are reasons, personal reasons, when he might stop for a period and change gear, but he's never really properly stopping. But I think certainly there were many Dylan critics who thought Under the Red Sky in the 90s was going to be his last album of original works or something. And I think he really did surprise people, you know, a decade where there were kind of two albums of as it turned out, of new music written by him that decade. I think people were really surprised how much he did later. And I don't know what the explanation is. I can't speak for him, but in many, you know, one option is that maybe he's happy where he is now. There's a kind of, you know, he's happy doing what he does, and he certainly seems happy on the road at any rate, much more than he's had an ambivalent relationship with recording studios. And one change that is worth mentioning is that from Love and Theft, which came out on 9/11, that very day as it happened, that was the first self-produced album under the pseudonym Jack Frost, and he's been producing his albums ever since, and he definitely seems more comfortable. I think he felt comfortable maybe in the very early days when it was just him and an acoustic guitar, but ever since he started producing his own records, I think we've had more of them than we would have otherwise expected.
I think it's worth adding that, I mean, yeah, absolutely, all of that makes sense to me. Yeah, I remember reading a review of Time Out of Mind when it came out in '96, and it said, enjoy this because this is going to be either the last or one of the last we'll ever hear from Dylan. Well, that didn't prove to be true. But one of the things I think of when I think of Dylan and him carrying on is that line in It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding. You know, he's not busy being born, he's busy dying. The guy is massively committed, I think, to creativity, to creating that self all the time, you know, and where he creates is in this form. I mean, he's got many forms. He's a great DJ, he kind of sculpts, he's an artist, but I think, you know, his singing, his songwriting, his music, that's where he's massively creative, and he's going to carry on because that's him.
Yeah. And what do you guys think that he wanted us to start thinking about, or to obviously continue thinking about politically and socially? What were the important issues to him at that time?
At which time? Sorry.
Oh, so sorry. Yeah, so it's my fault. Yeah, because I'm thinking back 60s, 70s.
I mean, I think, sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I think early on, race is really big for him, really important, and civil rights movement related to that. And it's quite interesting how, you know, some of those issues, you know, for a while we would associate as 60s issues, but in fact, they come up big time in kind of Black Lives Matter and Say Their Name and things like that. And Dylan always said their name in these songs. That's something that's very prevalent in the early songs, and it's something that's, I would say, you know, Dylan has changed, you know, 1,000 times over the years, but that has stayed with him, and he was very outspoken with George Floyd murder, for example. So that's something that has remained perhaps the only constant, even if the kinds of songs he writes are somewhat different now. The only constant, and Martin Luther King is still mentioned in the last album. So I think that was really big. And then at some point, those songs became just what people wanted him to do, and he wanted to move on. I think a lot of people were upset when he started writing personal songs, love songs, things like that. People wanted him to, for everything to be political. And of course, Dylan himself maybe thinks it all is political on some looser level. And he's since then written about all sorts of other political topics, but I would say race and civil rights were really big to begin with, but Gary may have additional themes to point us.
No, I think you're right. I think he's kind of the civil rights and kind of race, I think, was big for Dylan. He's written, you know, and performed incredibly important songs there in the early 60s. I mean, from Oxford Town, Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, Only a Pawn in Their Game is a terrific song, I think.
There's an essay in our book by Alexander Douglas on the sort of history of Black America and Bob Dylan and where he fits in with that. And it's an uneasy history because he at the same time owes a lot to, you know, people today talk of cultural appropriation, and Dylan is someone who arguably, while he's done so much in defense of Black America, arguably has culturally appropriated. And that's something that he's aware of. His album Love and Theft, in quotation marks, is partly about stealing what you love. And so there are these kind of really complicated
but you're also right that he shows a kind of empathy and a concern right the way through his career for the
All the
plight
way
of black
through.
people,
Yeah.
you know. And Blind Willie McTell, I think, is one of his greatest songs. In you know, an outtake from, ridiculously an outtake from Infidels. And it's I mean, the kind of incredibly intense way in a few verses, he kind of invokes a history of the United States and of oppression and of race and slavery, you know, and he's quoted as saying slavery is the most important thing when considering American politics and history, and he's right. And he's written about it and sung it incredibly well.
While stealing the tune of St. James.
Yeah, I know,
Infirmary.
but it's, as you will know, cultural appropriation is part of our identities, you know. And he does, as you say, in Love and Theft, that is all about. The whole album is about how we take things, you know, and how we must cherish it, but also still take, you know. And that, I think, and in fact, Love and Theft itself is a title he took from someone else. So he kind of
that's great.
It is great, you know, and the guy is very, very thoughtful, reflective, but, you know, all the way through, you know, I think Blind Willie McTell is a political song. I mean, but then one of the things he's also been very keen on is to highlight just how chillingly cynical politics can be and how the system, as it were, can be controlling. And then in the mid-60s, he really does push forward non-conformism, and he sees conformism on the left. And, you know, he's always hitting against that, you know. And so some late songs, they're inflected sometimes by religion, but political world trouble. These are highlighting some of the problems of systemic kind of systemic lack of trust, lack of decency, lack of openness within the system, you know. So the individual has to preserve themselves. But they've also got to show some cultural kind of authenticity, which can carry the public world, which I guess is what he's saying in Murder Most Foul, which he delivered fairly recently. So I think he's interesting politically, and he's always been critical of judges. I love that. And he's always critical of capital, actually. Union Sundown, he is a critique of contemporary or recent global capitalism. So he does deal with a lot of aspects of politics, you know, the system, the public world, the lack of integrity of the political world, of the public world of representation, you know, capital and its kind of remorseless kind of absorption of individuals. And he's always kind of had songs for outsiders, mavericks, kind of people who are downcast, people who are victims of the palpable victims of the system, and that includes poor Black people.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so sort of a few threads that we can kind of take here. Let me see. Okay, I want to kind of, this sucks. I hate having to choose between topics because I feel like this is so interesting. Okay, so in terms of cultural appropriation, in this case, I think this is so interesting because if you just think about something like hip hop music, right? So which is obviously predominantly done by Black people, and when they're taking these things that, you know, we call samples, where it's sort of music from funk, music from even maybe some reggae tracks, and they take these little bits and pieces and they turn them into rhymes, right, in the background. So or rather the rhymes are in the foreground and these kind of like little samples are in the background. One could say that, well, you know, they're also appropriating, right? They're appropriating music from someone else. Like Kanye West, I know this is a little bit more contemporary. With Kanye West, he had an issue with Shaka Khan because he took her through the fire sample, even though she allowed it, but he took it and he made it into like this little bit of a chipmunk voice, and she hated it. And she's like, I totally hate this song now. But if you think about it, that song that he made, Through the Wire, wouldn't have really been as significant as it would have been without the Shaka Khan sample. So, but he respected her, right? So even though obviously it didn't really work out, the way that he kind of says it is that, look, I took the sample because it's so meaningful to me and I genuinely really love the song. And thinking about Bob Dylan and, you know, again, appropriation, I wonder if in this case, by him labeling the album Love and Theft, if he's saying like, look, I know what I'm doing and I understand that this isn't something that's, you know, totally acceptable, but I love this music so much that it's so hard for me as a creative person not to be inspired by it in this way. So I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, I think
definitely. Sorry, that Love and Theft is definitely a nod to Eric Lott's book, which itself is about well, it's partly about blackface in early American music, which complicates Blackface minstrel. So it complicates the story even more. And it's definitely aware. There's on the new album, there's a song called Goodbye Jimmy Reed. The song for Charlie Patton earlier. I mean, he's always kind of name dropping those influences and doing things with them. But there is a side of Dylan, and especially early on, he says he works in a tradition of kind of music that's public domain or traditional, where it would be handed out sort of orally, and people would, you know, over the years change lyrics and change tunes, and he does that with his own songs. So he's really working within that tradition. And yet you would sort of see sometimes these traditional songs would suddenly appear even now on his website as copyright Bob Dylan, and you kind of think, what's going on there? What's happened there? And he would steal arrangements from people like Devon Ronk, for example, and then put them on his album, and so on. So there's some kind of slightly sneakier stuff going on, but at the same time, he definitely knows he's doing it, and he's kind of very aware of it and talks about it.
He's certainly aware about it, and I think you're right to bring up hip hop, and you know, I think popular culture, or any culture, T.S. Eliot, you know, is going to draw on other strands of that culture, preceding culture. With Constantine, occasionally Dylan, say on Modern Times, he kind of draws upon a few minor poets that people are not conversant with, and he doesn't flag what he's doing. So I'm not sure if people are going to pick up that reference and what it's doing, you know.
You mean Virgil by minor poet?
Yes, but no, I wasn't thinking of it. But when he talks about, and when he kind of when he records Rolling and Tumbling, you know, I mean, is there anyone who doesn't see Muddy Waters there, you know, and further back? So I think he, for the most part, is reflecting that. And to go back to what I said before about creativity being the most important thing for Dylan, lots of people think, including me, think of him as a supreme individualist, you know, someone who's very, very keen to kind of advocate, but also plumb the depths of his own inner psyche and creativity. But I think in Love and Theft and in other stuff, he's saying that creativity, when you create, you're not creating in abstraction from a wider culture. You're creating within a tradition. You're creating in relation to lots of other peoples and diverse. And he shows us how, you know, something that's thought to be simple, you know, songs, music, you know, fairly simple music. No, I mean, he shows so many strands and multiple kind of creative kind of connections to what's come before. And he is self-conscious of that. And Love and Theft is that. I mean, the guy is very interesting. I thought Modern Times hasn't been brought up as much as it might. That it strikes me, this is showing a homage to Charlie Chaplin and Modern Times. And the great song on that album is well, one of the great songs is Ain't Talking, you know, and Ain't Talking is, I think, a homage to kind of Charlie Chaplin. How can one be authentically kind of register what's going on in modern times, or the beginnings of modern times? Chaplin did it by retaining or trying the kind of the silent motif, you know, and railing against or resisting kind of talking, you know, but and in modern times that he doesn't talk apart from one bit. And Dylan in modern times isn't talking, you know, he's kind of preserving that integrity.
He's not talking to like 14 verses of it or something.
Yeah, but it's interesting. So I think he's commented on that kind of influence, creativity, interconnectedness, you know, and the inevitability of kind of creation taking part in a kind of in a much more complex web. And I think he's right to draw our attention to it.
Right. And it's also difficult. I mean, every time that you're creating, to sort of figure out what that line is between theft and, you know, borrowing, I guess, for lack of a better term. And
paying tribute is, of course, perfectly fine. And there's a lot of that kind of little nods here and there to things. So it is, a very sort of
It can be very difficult. It can be very difficult. You're right, you know. But we can all see it. I'm just trying to think of an example when it's done badly, when someone just lifts something without any life.
I have a great example. So do you guys remember the Queen and David Bowie song Under Pressure?
Yes.
Do you remember when Vanilla Ice made
Vanilla
Ice Baby?
Yeah, that's
And
a nice example.
Yeah, and it's like it's almost the same exact. It's not almost. It's the same exact tune. And Vanilla Ice's argument in court was like one ends with "s" and the other ends with "poop." It's like, what?
Yeah,
and that's the thing. It's making something greater from what you started, not an inferior kind of copy. There's an interview with Dylan where they push him on this, and he says, "You do it. You try and do what I do." And the truth is, what he comes up with, it isn't just a mere copy of something. He takes bits he likes, but creates something that's more often than not way more interesting than the thing he began with.
What I find interesting there is the song, which I think when it came out, I didn't warm to as much tight connection to my heart on the album Empire Burlesque, which a lot of people don't like. And he uses or invokes there lots of lines from kind of cinema, from movies,
Humphrey Bogart films,
from Humphrey Bogart. I mean, and a lot of the song is those lines, you know, and yet I think there's a real power to that song. You know, somehow or other, he's got kind of he's made it something interesting, you know, and that I think is a great art, you know, that he uses material.
Yeah, and so during the time, like when he sort of first became sort of notable and popular, what do you guys think separated him at the time from other artists?
Well, I think there's at least two kind of things. As a performer, there's a lot of artists where you hear them, whether at the time their record is out, or like 2 years later, or 5 years later, or even 20 years later at their reunion concerts, and it still sounds just like the record when you hear it live. And some people like that. It's not an easy thing to do. Dylan, even the day after, it's completely different. Like, you know, the voice might be recognizably Dylan, but it's also not the same voice. It changes. It's nasal in 1 year, and it's really throaty in the next, and everything is kind of changing. He does a tour, and he'll open with a song that never made it onto any album and never reappears again. Let's Tell Me Mama in '66, for example. Which we don't even, I think, have a studio recording of. I don't know where that came out. So there's something that's just always kind of moving, always raw, always new. It doesn't feel like an artificial product. This is someone who every time he does a new take of a song, the lyrics have changed. So I think that really he stands out in this way. And then more traditionally, and here that it's a matter of partly a matter of taste, I think, but people do think, okay, well, maybe in terms of guitar playing or piano playing, that there are so many people who could match him or do better, and the voice, of course, is an acquired taste. But in terms of the lyrics and combining the lyrics with the tune, I think maybe Leonard Cohen is very close. Of course, Leonard Cohen has his range of work is a lot smaller than Dylan's, but there aren't many, and it is a matter of taste. There are people who say Joni Mitchell, for example, Patti Smith. I'm not saying he's unique, but it's a small range of people we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think it is that creativity that Dylan's got. I mean, which I think Constantine was kind of rehearsing a bit there. The guy is massively creative. And I think if someone's renewing themselves all the time, if they continue to be creative, then they're going to kind of keep going, I think. And that's going to kind of attract, whereas I think a lot of people, and people talk about 1 or 2 albums, that people make, and then their creativity goes, so I think he's got massive energy and creativity. He's also, I think the lyrics are really, really terrific. They're deceptively, they're deceptively good. I know one of the early folk crowd asked him, or you know, hey, I mean, what advice would you give me on lyrics, you know, to improve and so on, and he said, well, keep it simple, you know. I mean, so he does keep it pretty simple, but it's actually interesting, engaging, and thoughtful. He's asking questions more than delivering answers, as I said before, and I think that contributes to the power and the force of him, you know, much more than other say early
there's a
kind of folk singers.
There's a kind of paradox with Dylan, which is that his very early fame comes because he does kind of attach himself to a bandwagon of, you know, Pete Seeger and those kind of songs, and a kind of movement in New York, and he makes sure he's at the right place at the right time. Joan Baez and Carolyn Hester, and so, but and his initial fame is partly due to kind of being quite timely in this way, and probably very sort of in a quite a calculated manner. But ever since, he's just going against the grain. It's always the opposite. It's always going against the grain. And it's very different from, say, David Bowie's career, where he's kind of following trends in the 60s and the 70s, you know, very creative, very original, amazing songwriter. But he tends to follow the trends. Oh, it's techno, you know, and so, and Dylan is really not doing that. Sometimes his producers in the 80s might have sort of imposed a kind of production on an album, but hence his liberation now from that. But other than that, he's very different, I'd say.
He's also a pretty I mean, and you were referring to the fact that his musicianship and voice maybe are kind of acquired taste, but there's a power to his voice and singing. I mean, I think John Boldy on the lyrics on the liner notes to the first three, the triple kind of original bootleg album, said that Moonshiner is massively worth listening to because it's sung so brilliantly. And anyone who says that Dylan hasn't got a voice will have to listen to that. Yeah, we'll have to listen to that song, you know, and it is an amazing version, Moonshiner. Anyone, you know, who wants to hear Dylan, go and listen to that. But and you know, he still sings brilliantly. I think you listen to the '85 song "Dark Eyes"; it's very, very well sung, I think. Yeah, and on his latest album, his voice is really quite powerful still. You know, I can't think of many people who could do the Murder Most Foul and do it as well. I can't think of anyone. You know, it's such a his voice is such a powerful instrument, I think, and as Constantine was saying, it's also subtly changing all the time. You know, people think of it as a caricatured, one-dimensional thing, but you never hear him sing the same.
The repertoire, there's no single song that you can go to a Dylan concert and know that he will play, when so many of his peers will, you know, they might have a new album to play songs from, but they'll largely be doing a kind of greatest hits set, and you'll know exactly what the hits will be. And that just is never going to happen with Dylan. He had a phase, he had in the 70s, he had a kind, but even then he would be changing the tunes and the lyrics and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm actually curious to know what or who were his influences. It's something I've actually never known about him.
Well,
you want to go first, Gary, or should I?
Well, I'll go first. It's a difficult one because there are so many influences. You know, I mean, he kind of he was massively interested in listening to music from a very young age, and there's some kind of audio stuff of him talking to a school friend, and he's talking intelligently and thoughtfully about country music. You know, so he listened to Hank Williams a lot. You know, so Hank Williams mattered an awful amount. He was interested in Little Richard. You know, when Little Richard died recently, he kind of was genuinely upset because Little Richard was massive. You know, he moved. That was rock and roll was dangerous. You know, so rock and roll, you know, country music, and then he came across Woody Guthrie, and he thought, this guy's authentic. This guy's got power. You know, and he kind of heard, and he listened to everything of Woody Guthrie and became a Woody Guthrie jukebox, and he read Woody Guthrie. So the folk and the blues, he was listening to blues from an early age, you know, and I think his kind of assimilation of blues is really quite impressive. So musically and gospel he listened to. So you know, he was massively influenced by the major currents of kind of popular music and traditional music he listened to, you know, from a young age. So he's been kind of working through that for a long time. So I think Hank Williams and kind of Woody Guthrie are there. The great blues, Delta blues people mattered a lot to him, and so, hence Blind Willie McTell is a kind of is a homily to an influence, you know, and that's and rock and roll, you know, so it's pretty diverse, pretty kind of yeah, and you know, he's delivered tribute albums actually to Jimmy Rogers and Hank Williams, and that reflects him, and now he's sung about Jimmy Reed and Blind Willie McTell, so you get a sense of the people.
There's more. Sonny Boy Williams is another. Count Basie, kind of more jazz blues. He takes stuff from gospel, of course, quite a lot.
Yeah.
Mavis Staples, for example.
Greek poetry, he was also influenced by.
Yeah,
you know,
Ginsberg and Kerouac, and was an influence on Ginsberg. So it was a two-way kind of thing. But yeah, this is someone who is already playing music in the late 50s. Elvis is a kind of hero. Buddy Holly. He claims to have seen live, and so he actually starts with the rock and roll and then moves on to kind of blues, country, and folk. But he listens, you know, he listens to new artists now. He's, you know, quoting. He'll quote like Lady Gaga or whatever, Alicia Keys, but he'll mention in lyrics. But when he does the DJ show, when he does like over 100 episodes, kind of 80% of that is from before the 60s. And you know, they asked him about, you know, why is there so little new music? There is new music there, but not that much. And they ask him, and he kind of replies, well, there's just so much more of the past than the present, and that's kind of, you know. And
Susie Rotolo, his early girlfriend, whose photograph is on the front of Freewheeling, you know, Dylan is with her. Her autobiography is worth reading, actually, in that she describes how kind of quickly Dylan picks things up. You know, how he did in those early 60s when he was with her. She was a set designer at a Brecht kind of theatre production, and Dylan went along, and he then kind of absorbed some Brecht music, and very quickly he's kind of assimilated it and got to know it. You know, Stephen Sedley writes in our book Dylan at 80, and Stephen Sedley is a nice guy who kind of was a member of the an appeal court judge in the UK, but he was also a kind of a commentator on folk music for Tribune, the left-wing kind of political kind of journal, and he kind of he was interested in folk music and went to folk music sessions, and he went to the Troubadour where Dylan appeared in '63 and kind of listened to Dylan. And I asked Stephen Sedley, you know, what Dylan was like, and he said Dylan was interesting, and what he found notable was that people sang songs, and at the end of the evening they kind of got together and with songs, and Dylan could repeat after one hearing all the a number of the songs. That Dylan had a very good ear and could kind of assimilate them very quickly. So I think Dylan has this capacity to pick up stuff, which is
and stuff from everywhere, from paintings, from film, texts, Japanese lines from Japanese novels appearing, Henry Rollins,
and stories in newspapers, you know.
Yes.
So yeah.
Wow. Yeah, and then just kind of taking it back to an earlier kind of point of our conversation, right, about him bucking trends. How does, I mean, first of all, I want to know, how does like a person just, how are they able to do that, right? Because it obviously takes a sort of a high level of determination to do something like that. But in terms of what Bob Dylan has actually said about that, right? Why were trends, okay, I don't want to kind of put words into his mouth, but why was it so important for him to go against the trends and be authentic, obviously, as opposed to be somebody like David Bowie, or even honestly a Lady Gaga, which, I mean, even though she's unique to some extent, she's also pretty like trendy in terms of the music out now.
I mean, I think there's a kind of, sorry, Gary, there's a sort of, part of it is a character trait. Like it's quite well known that if he was in the studio and someone said, you know, oh, that's a really great song, that's my favorite, he'd take it off the album.
Wow.
So that happened, you know, a fair amount.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I don't have an explanation for this, but that there's kind of quite strong evidence that this sort of thing would happen, or he'd take it off the set list, or whatever. And there's a sort of sense of not doing things in order to please a particular person or group of people, I suppose. Gary was talking about his individualism earlier on, and there's some of that. I think we spoke earlier about the people calling him the voice of his generation and so on, and he kind of wants to kind of push away from that. I think there was a period when he was quite frankly worried he'd get shot after John Lennon and so on, and just wants to sort of also distance himself from those kind of things. But sorry, Gary, you were gonna...
No, I think I'd agree with you. There are different things going on, and part of it is perversity. Like on Empire Burlesque, you know, there was the original version of Brownsville Girl, which is a great song, New Danville Girl, and the people backing it thought this was tremendous, but he didn't put it on the album. So there we are. And Blind Willie McTell, most people would see as his most distinguished song of the 80s. That didn't make it onto the album. But
and then I guess another piece of the explanation is he just doesn't care, and it's a lot easier when you don't care. And I think he's reached the point for quite a long time now where, you know, selling the most number of records isn't the most important thing to him.
Yeah, and I think someone said to him, you know, why wasn't Blind Willie McTell on the album? And he said, look, there will be other albums. It's not so important. But having said that, I mean, I think there's a sense in which he doesn't care, or he's being perverse. But I think when I was talking earlier about his creativity, I think he knows that, he has a strong sense the one thing he wants to nurture and maintain is creativity, because people who haven't got that die on stage, or he not busy being born, is busy dying. And how he maintains his creativity is to kind of be very intensive about making sure it's him, that he's not just subscribing to a trend, that he's not following other leaders, you know, he's not watching his parking meters, you know, he's going to kind of be authentic, you know, in thinking it through, reflecting and creating.
It's a kind of Nietzschean thing, and he has a lot in common with Nietzsche, insofar as Nietzsche is also someone who we think of as a highly original thinker, but who kind of takes all his ideas from other places and then just makes something fresh with it. But sometimes word for word, you'll find these sentences elsewhere. But you know, we were talking earlier about when he went electric, and people famously talk about the person shouting Judas and all the booing. But I think focusing on the booing, imagine night after night playing to audiences who are really booing you, all right? And this does something to you, right? You either are the kind of person who says, oh, they don't like this, I'd better give them something they like tomorrow or next year or whatever, or he got a kind of energy from this and kind of went the other way, and you know, is like, well, you must be awfully rich to you know, come here just to boo, to buy these tickets night after night just to boo. But he got a kind of energy for it, and it made the music better, more aggressive, and it did something to him. And I certainly think there's a turning point there where you know, once he's changed direction and he gets that response, there's no looking back, and it's just, I'm not doing anything.
But I think, yeah, I agree. But I think a response from the fans, you know, the booing is very tough, and he reacted in a very positive way. But when he kind of you know, after 79, he for a period he was only singing his religious songs in concerts, and some fan put up, you know, Jesus Loves You early songs too, you know, and that kind of irony, I think, was maybe a better way of handling Dylan's kind of sheer determination to separate himself from the audience.
And people were, I mean, and he tends to be right in the long run. People were walking out of those concerts, and now they're hailed as some of his best, as were the ones that people were booing at. So sometimes it's also, you know, we talk about perversity and things, but it's also, he thinks this is good. He's like, this is good. And I'm going to do this, and this is what I want to do, and this is what my heart's in. My heart isn't in playing my greatest hits right now. If I miss them, I'll play them. And he's confident. He's very confident that this is what he's doing.
Constantine is right. He's been proved right a number of times, massively, like the electric phase. Very difficult to find someone now who says that he should have stuck to the acoustic and not gone electric. I think it would be a good argument to make, but I think no one does that. And as Constantine says, you know, the gospel stuff is now regarded as massively good, and gospel has become...
The 80s stuff is having a real
massive
kind of
revival.
revival.
Wow. So Constantine, because you said it was a personality trait, would you say that he was a contrarian?
I think there's certainly a contrarian in him. I don't want to say that kind of characterizes his entire personality, but that's definitely there. Yeah.
Gary, you're nodding. Yeah, you're agreeing.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, but also with the caveat that Constantine said, you know, there's more there than that. You know, I mean, you know, I can be contrarian in some moods, but I'm not Dylan.
Okay, and then so one of our final questions before we begin to wrap up, obviously, how did you guys start on this project and obviously develop it, and how did it become Dylan at 80?
So as you were saying when you introduced us, Gary had worked on a book before on the political art of Bob Dylan. Gary and I used to be colleagues at Oxford Brookes, and so we go way back as friends and Dylan fans and Hegel fans and all sorts of things. And I sort of embarrassingly late. So Dylan turned 80 last May. So May 2021, and it would have been October 2020. So 8 months before or whatever, where I kind of thought, oh, we should do something. I mean, I think we were always going to do something about it, and we just assumed it would be like a day of events or something, and so there was plenty of time to sort it out a few months in advance. And I suddenly thought, no, we should do a book. And you know, Dylan had a record out that year, and so it got a lot of people through COVID, and there was a real Dylan community on Twitter talking about what that record did to them. And Dylan seemed to be doing stuff as he was approaching his 80th year, and little did we know how much he was going to do after he turned 80. And so I told Gary, you know, what about this? And there's all these people we can invite, and we can have a mix of like philosophers and politics people, but there's all these people on social media who have Dylan podcasts, so we invited some of those people, and just kind of, it was a real mix. It's like over 30 short essays. We've got musicians in there, we've got people from literature, people from religion, kind of, it's a real I mean, we think it really worked out in the end. And we said, right, how on earth are we going to get this done on time? So we made them short essays, and not only did people say yes, but it kind of spread, and people were inviting themselves to write essays. I couldn't say no to everybody. It got a little embarrassing at some point. And the book came out a little after his 80th birthday, but in his 80th year. And it allowed us to, we managed to sneak in our introduction as we were doing the proofs, stuff he'd been doing. He released a special during his 80th year of completely new versions of his early songs. He then went on tour, and so on. So it really came out that. And one thing we wanted to do, I mean, here we are, sort of 4 men. Gary doesn't have a beard, but 3 bearded white blokes and another sort of, and we really wanted to kind of get a real mix of kind of nationalities, genders, age groups, so that it wasn't just sort of 50-year-old white men writing about Dylan. So that was a big part of our kind of thing, was to bring together old and new voices. Michael Gray, who's been a Dylan scholar for decades and is incredible, and then much younger kind of 20-year-olds writing from very different perspective and different backgrounds. I'll let Gary speak now.
Yeah, you've said a lot, and that's great, because and also I should kind of just emphasize that the inspiration for the book came from Constantine. First of all, he got in contact with me and said, "Hey, let's do a book." Dylan was 80, and I said something like, "But we've got no time." Because there isn't much time at all, and there wasn't, because we had to get a publisher, we had to get lots of people, we had to edit it. It was a massive undertaking. I don't think any book has been moved so quickly. And people, I was going to say, you're talking to 2 people who work. Hercules has got nothing on us. We can out kind of muscle Hercules in getting stuff done. No, and it was fun. And there are 35 or 36, it depends how you count them, contributions, essays, and we kind of edited them, and we've got all kinds of people. We really wanted all kinds of people. So there were really famous philosophers. There's very important Dylanologists like Michael Gray and so on. But then there are kind of youngish people who haven't written much on Dylan, who are running cafes, and we thought this is the kind of book we want, and it's the kind of book we got. And I think we're both really pleased with it, aren't we? That, and I ran in in the neighborhood. I met Stephen Sedley, who's a kind of appeal court judge who knew Dylan when he was in England in the early 60s. And I thought this is an opportunity to get him to write something, So
I was going to say, we've got like Mick Gold, who's a documentary maker, who's done films on like Watergate and Cuba and so on, and musicians like Robin Hitchcock and Amy Rigby, Emma Swift, Bob Younger. And we got a really variety of people.
I bumped into a number of years ago. I went to a Dylan conference in Portugal, and I met a couple of people. But a person who stood out for me was Natalie Ferris, who gave a paper on Dylan and sculpture. So I asked her to write something for the book, and she did. She's now at Durham University.
And Ray Falk, who organized the 2 big Isle of Wight festivals that Dylan and Cohen famously appeared in 69 and 70. And so, and through this, we've been sort of, since then, we've done some virtual shows and things, and we've met some of the musicians he played with, like Scarlett Rivera, Carolyn Hester, and we've just sort of, it's been quite interesting entering the kind of this world since then.
Yeah, and really good. I mean, I agree with Dylan, actually. Creativity and creating this book has been a lot of fun. And
they were really amazingly punctual. 35 people, they delivered on time.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really quite impressive and good stuff.
Yeah. And I love the fact that this one person's music literally spurred this entire community.
Yeah.
And it kind of united them during COVID, and it was really good.
Yeah,
feeling.
and we get kind of I get a lot of positive feedback on the book. It's actually made people smile, and that's worth a lot.
I love that. And then, so Constantine, can you tell us where we can find the book, and obviously the discount
I was going to say,
even
Dylan is smiling on the cover. Not everyone likes the smiling Dylan. People are used to a very different kind of Dylan. So it's edited by Gary and me. It's published by Imprint. You can get it on pretty much all the online bookshops, including Amazon in the States. But if you go to Imprint Academic's own website, which is just imprintacademic.com, with the discount code is it's CAT21, so CAT in capital letters 21. and that will give you a pretty good discount, and even the worldwide postage is pretty affordable, so it comes out better than Amazon, say, overall. So that's a nice place to get it from as well. But you can find it from online bookshops and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And it's I don't know, in dollars, it's like a paperback, so it's about £15 here, so 20 something dollars, something like that.
Yeah, and we've had a lot of fun doing it. We put on an event at the Troubadour in the Folk Club, and that was a lot of fun. And Emma Swift and Barb Younger sang, and that was really good. We're putting on another gig at Oxford Brookes University on April the 8th, and that will be fun. And Barb Younger's appearing at that one.
I love it.
And
All right.
Nana Muscari liked it. She wrote us a little blurb. I don't know if that's visible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nana.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah,
I love it.
And Scarlett Rivera and Carolyn Hester loved it, so that's good.
All right, Alan, any final questions for them before we go?
Oh, yes. If we wanted to follow both of you, where could we find you? Where could we find your work?
Let's start with Constantine.
You can find Gary hiding in his basement. No, you can find me. C Sandis on Twitter is probably the easiest place to find me, unless you're roaming the streets of Chelsea and London, in which case I might bump into you.
Awesome. I think, Gary, where can we find you?
Well, you can find me on Twitter as well. Yeah, Gary Browning on Twitter. On Facebook, you can find me.
Aren't you Gary Browning 74 or something? What are you?
I've forgotten what it is, but it's Gary Browning something. Yeah.
We'll post it in this.
Yeah.
There's only one of me. There's loads of him.
Yeah, Gary Browning, I think 74, but it's on Twitter. You'll see who it is. I'm on kind of Facebook. I'm at Oxford Brookes, and like Constantine, I've written a fair number of books, so people might know. I've written on Hegel. I've written on Iris Murdoch, whom I like a lot.
And Dylan at 80 is on Twitter. Our publisher has that account. I don't really know what she does with it, but tweets about Dylan, I guess, or about Dylan.
Yeah, and
so
she's got about,
too.
and the book's got about 200 followers, so that's fine. Yeah. And
All
thanks
right,
a lot. Thanks
absolutely.
a lot.
Thank you
Guys,
so much.
Thank you guys so much. Yeah, I have so much insight into Bob. Like, wow. I mean, even just the fact that he's a contrarian, now, like, I love this guy a lot. So again, thank you. Thank you guys so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Terrific.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. That was awesome. First of all, I'm getting the book right away. Second of all, guys, thank you so much for watching. You can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Like, subscribe,
Hit the bell.
hit the bell. And thank you so much for watching. See you next time.